Hello and welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on the Picture of Dorian Gray, chapter 6. So today we're looking at the chapter where Lord Henry, Basil and Dorian are meeting for dinner, and they are about to go and see Sybil's performance. So at first it's just Lord Henry and Basil discussing Dorian's engagement, and we get some nice insights into their different views on marriage and love. And then Dorian arrives and they speak for a while before leaving for the theatre, and that's where the chapter ends off. So we now get to explore Lord Henry's reaction to the engagement as he then tells Basil. And so Basil's first reaction is disbelief. I can't believe it. Dorian is far too sensible. Well, perhaps the Dorian he knew is far too sensible. And then Lord Henry quips, Dorian is far too wise to not do foolish things now and then, my dear Basil. Paradox there, one of Lord Henry's aphorisms. And Basil says, well, marriage is hardly a thing one can do now and then, Harry. And so we'll see throughout their interaction that Basil's concerns about the marriage are more for Dorian's well-being, and he says, think of Dorian's birth and position and wealth. It would be absurd for him to marry so much beneath him. And I've already talked about how Sybil Vane is not technically an ideal match for Dorian because of her position versus his wealth and status. Oops, gone one too far. And so Henry says, if you want to make him marry her, then tell him that. It's sure to do it. Whenever a man does a thoroughly stupid thing, it's always from the noblest motives. That's tapping into, I suppose, all of our reaction to being told not to do something is you immediately want to then go and do it. And Dorian would then be noble. In other words, he doesn't feel like he's above Sybil. So Basil then says he hopes that she is good because he doesn't want Dorian tied to some vile creature who might degrade his nature and ruin his intellect. So again, his concern is for Dorian's well-being. Lord Henry murmurs, she's better than good. She is beautiful. Okay. And Dorian says she's beautiful. He's not often wrong. Your portrait of him has quickened his appreciation of the personal appearance of other people. Now, if we really want to get into it and go back to the second chapter, we'll remember that it wasn't the portrait that quickened Dorian's appreciation of personal appearance, but Lord Henry drawing Dorian's attention to the beauty of his appearance, and then the portrait kind of being the light bulb moment which took Lord Henry's ideas and made them real to Dorian. Basil continues with his concern and he says to Henry, do you approve of it? You can't approve of it possibly. It's some silly infatuation. And we know that Basil has kind of hit the nail on the head there because Dorian's love for Sybil is very superficial and is definitely more infatuation than true love. Harry says, I never approve or disapprove of anything. It's an absurd attitude. We are not sent into the world to air our moral prejudices, which is highly ironic because Lord Henry often airs his moral prejudices. Okay. And we've heard Lord Henry talk before about his cynicism when it comes to women and marriage. He expounds on that now and he says the drawback of marriage, it makes one unselfish. Unselfish people are colorless. They lack individuality. Now, obviously, for most people, unselfishness is a virtue. But Lord Henry finds people who are unselfish to be boring. I hope Dorian Gray will make this girl his wife, passionately adore her for 6 months, and then suddenly become fascinated by someone else. He would be a wonderful study. Note the use of the word study there. In the previous, in chapter 4, we heard Lord Henry remark that Dorian is an interesting study, and he looks at him almost from a scientific point of view. So again, he's reiterating the idea that he doesn't really care for Dorian's well-being and Dorian's possible broken heart, but he just enjoying, like, relishing in how the entire situation plays out. Basil seems to see more of good in Harry than there possibly is, and he says, "You don't mean that. If Dorian Gray's life was spoiled, no one would be sorrier than yourself. You are much better than you pretend to be." Um, and I think in some ways, as you read through the novel, you'll find that might be true. Lord Henry, in many ways, is more talk than action. He talks a big game, but is actually, compared to Dorian, I suppose, fairly straight-laced, and perhaps says things for their shock value rather than for actually meaning it. But in some ways, he doesn't really look much deeper into Dorian's life than what's happening on the surface. And while Basil, once he learns of the rumors of Dorian's nocturnal activities, etc., the rumors about him, he is very concerned. Lord Henry never really seems to mention concern about this, so perhaps his understanding of Dorian is as superficial as Dorian's is of other people. So Dorian arrives, and Basil says, "I hope you'll always be very happy, but I don't quite forgive you for not having let me know of your engagement. You let Harry know." This harkens on to Basil's sort of continued concern that he's losing touch with Dorian, and that Dorian is becoming more friendly and closer with Lord Henry, and that the mark of a friendship is that you tell somebody your good news, but Dorian didn't bother to tell Basil. Maybe deep down he knew Basil would have concerns. Okay. This is a very interesting little portion. It's Dorian describing the moment that he and Sybil became engaged. And then Lord Henry saying, "Well, actually, did you ask her?" And then we found out not really. It just kind of was assumed. So they were sitting together. Suddenly there came into eyes a look I'd never seen before. My lips moved towards hers. We kissed each other. Can't describe to you what I felt at that moment. It seemed to me that all my life had been narrowed to one perfect point of rose-colored joy. She trembled all over and shook like a white narcissus. Not the first time we've had a reference to Narcissus and the floral imagery of Sybil's little lips. Then she flung herself on her knees and kissed my hands. Of course, our engagement is a dead secret. She has not even told her mother. I don't know what my guardians will say. And here Dorian expresses that he knows his guardian, Lord Radley is his guardian because his grandfather has passed on, will be furious and won't approve of it, but he doesn't care because in less than a year he will be of age. And then he says to Basil, "Don't you approve of me taking my love out of poetry and finding my wife in Shakespeare's plays? Lips that Shakespeare taught to speak have whispered their secret in my ear. I have had the arms of Rosalind around me and kissed Juliet on the mouth." Again, reminding us that Dorian's love for Sybil is based on perhaps more on the characters, the romantic character she plays, than the actual character of or personality of the girl herself. At what particular point did you mention the word marriage? Dear Harry, I did not treat it as a business transaction. I did not make a formal proposal. I told her I loved her. She said she was not worthy to be my wife. And Lord Henry hones in on the idea that women are wonderfully practical in situations. We often forget to say anything about marriage, and they always remind us. So a little jibe there, suggesting that Sybil assumed and Dorian didn't stop her. But of course, if they're taking their love story out of the books of Shakespeare, that seems right on the money in terms of how marriages and proposals work. Then Dorian is telling Basil and Henry what he wants them to see Sybil, and he says, when you see them, you'll feel a man that could wrong her would be a beast without a heart. I love that quote because it comes right back to remind you when he is being so horrific to her in the following chapter, and is definitely acting as a beast without a heart. And then we see that reflected in the painting a little bit later in the following chapter. I cannot understand how anyone can wish to shame the things he loves. I love Sybil Vane. I want to place her on a pedestal of gold. What is marriage? An irrevocable vow. Don't mock, he says. It's a vow I want to make to her. Her trust makes me faithful. Her belief makes me good. When I'm with her, I regret all that you have taught me. The mere touch of Sybil Vane's hands makes me forget all your wrong, fascinating, poisonous, delightful theories. Another very important quote here. Remember, we talked about how Dorian is not completely oblivious of the impact that Lord Henry's ideas are having on him, and the fact that he says that they are wrong, but fascinating, poisonous, and delightful. You see the negative, positive descriptions there. He knows that though they are fascinating and delightful, they are also not entirely okay. And so Lord Henry delights in sounding surprised. What theories are those? Well, your theories about life, about love, about pleasure, all your theories, in fact, Harry. And Dorian says, I now know what pleasure is. It's to adore someone. Being adored is a nuisance, says Harry. Women treat us as humanity treats us God. They worship us and they're always bothering us to do something for them. And Dorian disagrees and says they create love in our natures and they have the right to demand it back. So Harry sees constant female adoration as something that is a bit tiresome. And the romantic Dorian and Basil say that's true. They have the right to demand love. And then Henry says, nothing is ever quite true. You must admit, Harry, says Dorian, that women give to men the very gold of their lives. And Harry says, well, that's the worry. They inspire us the desire to do masterpieces and prevent us from carrying them out. So again, his cynicism for women here comes in where he says that they act as a muse, but they distract one from doing anything of worth. Remember, he's also said that marriage makes people unselfish and colourless. Harry, you are dreadful. I don't know why I like you so much. You will always like me, Dorian, he replied. And this isn't the first time he's intimated something along these lines. And he says, you will always be fond of me. I represent to you all the sins you never had the courage to commit. And that becomes interesting later in the book because then Dorian sort of comes to represent the sins that perhaps Henry never had the courage, but didn't have the beauty and the youth and the opportunity perhaps to commit. But Lord Henry's ideas definitely represent the sinful side of nature, the indulgence in the aesthetics, in the beauty, in pleasure, and new hedonism, as he expressed it in chapter 2. And so you'll see at the end of this chapter, then Dorian and Basil go off in Henry's carriage, which only has room for 2. And so poor old Basil is left to follow on his own. And he has this moment where he kind of looks out the window and feels desolate all over again, as he did at the end of chapter 2, to show that he's lost or is losing Dorian Gray. He could not bear this marriage, and yet it seemed to him better than any other things that might have happened. But a strange sense of loss came over him. He felt that Dorian would never again be to him all he had been in the past. And when the cab drew up to the theatre, it seemed to him he had grown years older. Okay, so we've got this lovely sort of sense of anticipation of Henry and Basil seeing Cyril act for the first time. And Basil's reaction to the marriage versus Lord Henry's reaction to the marriage, and a reminder of the influence of all of Henry's theories on Dorian. Plus, we've had the the constant reminder of Henry's view of marriage compared to the romantic view that Dorian still seems to hold.